Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Hey, Josh, it's springtime. One of the things I really enjoy doing in my neighborhood is seeking out and finding those morel mushrooms. And I get a little frustrated with maybe my ability to find them. And then more importantly, frustrated maybe with my friends that send me a Snapchat and they have this big pile of morel mushrooms and then they put on there this emoji that's the like, don't tell me the location. That's just kind of frustrating. The flavor of them, I don't know, every year just blows me away.
Bruce, mushroom hunting down here, it's almost like a tradition that you have to go do. I've never found any mushrooms, and I remember my great grandpa Bowden, we'd always go hunting, and he would say, "Oh, we can't find anything." But he knows he was marking spots in his head. He would see these areas where he's like, "There's mushrooms over there," and he'd walk with us and be like, "Well, we didn't find anything." The second we got back home, he'd go back out and he'd repick them. So I've never been successful because I've never been told those secrets because it was secrets. Because if you go out and pick those mushrooms, he can't have them. So it was always stressful trying to try and find and compete with them. I know we did an open hike night last night out at Canner's Cave, and we had one of our participants. We had a wildfire that took over some of our area down there. And he said, "Oh, those would be the best places to look because once that
Mm.
fire burns, there's new growth as long as it's in the right spot and there's plenty of moisture." He's like, "I bet there's mushrooms over there." So I might actually be sneaking out trying to look for some mushrooms soon.
I suspect my dad is also still visiting the farm that I live on and cherry picking those mushrooms out from where he knows they're at and has yet to tell me. So, speaking today of conservation places and the outdoors, our topic today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the millions of acres in the U.S. that we've really dedicated to land conservation here in the U.S. And the question that we're going to pose is, are we better off in agriculture by having those conservation efforts here in the United States? And we have not a better expert to speak on this. And we have with us today Brent Sohngen, and colleague of ours at Ohio State University. And Brent is a distinguished professor of environmental and natural resources economics at the Ohio State University here in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. Brent received his doctorate in environmental and resource economics in 1996 and conducts research on the economics of land use changes in forestry, the design of incentive mechanisms for water and carbon trading, carbon sequestration, and the valuation of environmental resources. Dr. Sanjan recently co-authored a book, Reversing Deforestation: How Market Forces and Property Rights Are Saving Forests in Latin America. And he has written over 165 peer-reviewed journal articles, monographs, and book chapters. And Brent, I really appreciate the fact that you're teaching sustainability at Ohio State food systems, and I really appreciated this last winter catching up with you on your presentations on the energy markets, and looking forward to hearing about your topic today. Brent, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. One thing I noticed there in the intro, though, was that neither of you gave a site location on those mushrooms. Both of you kind of talked around that subject matter. So, if you want to throw it in the chat there, you can put some X and Y coordinates on there. That's great.
I guess we're guilty of the same thing that we accused our neighbors and sometimes family members of doing as well, Brent.
Yeah, I love it. Love it.
Well, Brent, 300 million acres in the United States sounds like a lot of land in conservation. How does it compare to the total land surface in the United States, and what does it all include?
That's only land. I mean, we actually have, I don't know the number, but we have a large area also in the ocean that's protected, these sort of marine protected areas. But on the land, that's 13% of the land surface of the US. I think there's what, 2.2, 2.3 billion acres in the US of total land. And so it's a big chunk, right? 13%. So yeah, it's huge. It includes land all over the country. It includes both private and publicly protected land. So everything from if your neighbor has a piece of land that they may still even probably not farm. No, that does not include farmland, but does include protected sort of things that would be private landowners who've put their land into some sort of protected status, potentially with like the Nature Conservancy or some other reserve locally, state land, say in Ohio and in other states. federal land, national parks, national forests, maybe wildlife areas, things like that. So it's a huge area of land, and really it's pretty much all over the US. And probably the average for, Ohio is interesting because we have such a small amount of publicly protected land, but we actually have a huge amount of privately protected land. So it's really, in the West, if you go to Nevada, Nevada's like 90% public land. And so they have very little privately protected land. But here in the East, we have a lot more of this sort of private protection where people just decide they don't want to do anything with their land other than just watch the trees grow or have some place out there where there's grasslands or something like that. And so they protect it themselves.
So, Brent, the beauty of the United States is it's that it's so diverse. There's all different types of areas, there's all different types of landscapes. If we look at the United States, I always like to brag about Ohio. Ohio's very different. You look at the northern side, it's very flat, but you get down in my neck of the woods, we got those rolling hills where we roll right into West Virginia and just other places like Yellowstone or the Great Smoky Mountains. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of U.S. land conservation?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And I'm kind of with you. I love the diversity we have in the US. And I'll be honest that I'm a bit of an environmentalist, but there's nothing I like better than getting in the car and driving west, honestly, and just seeing everything you can see between here and the coast, or just getting as far as you can go. And just having a look. But yeah, the history of conservation in the US, of course, it's, our country has some of the most famous conservationists historically, going all the way back to, Thoreau, and the northeastern US, concerns about sort of deforestation there. And those concerns just kept going as we moved west and as settlers moved west. And, as settlers moved west, along with them came people who had interest in, trying to create a balance between what was being used for agriculture mostly at the time and maybe a bit of industry, because of course we got most of our energy back in those days from either from river systems and being able to harvest energy from river systems, and also from forests, right, being able to cut down trees and use it as an energy source. So a lot of people sort of reacted to that and thought, we also need to do some conservation. Perhaps the most famous person, at least in my mind, is Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, who did a lot for conservation in the early 1900s. And but it didn't start there. Probably I guess the first national park in the U.S. was really actually in the 1830s, Hot Springs in Arkansas. But most people don't think of that a lot. What they really think about is Yellowstone in 1872. But even before Yellowstone, Yosemite is an interesting case, right? Because Yosemite was well known in the 1850s to settlers in California for its beauty. And there was a big movement by a lot of people to try to protect that area, because people had seen, really, I think what they looked at was what happened around Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls had blown up by that point as a tourist spot, and there was a lot of mayhem there. And so there was a lot of concern that the same thing could happen in Yosemite Valley. And so, the federal government, because it sort of owned the land, made a grant to the state of California, as long as the state would protect that land in the 1860s. And so they sort of made that grant, and California agreed to sort of protect the land. And of course, it didn't become a national park until the 1890s, but it is, as a protected area by the state of California. It kind of precedes a good bit of, or by a good bit, what happened in Yellowstone later in 1872. So we really started out way back in the 1800s with protection, and it's kind of continued all the way up to the present time. We still do a lot of it, and we still argue about it. And that's kind of what's fun about the U.S. too, is we have a lot of discussions, and we take the concept seriously, right? We don't just sort of say that this is something we have to do. We say this is something we think we should do, and then we have a good debate and a discussion about it.
So, Brent, when and why did concerns about forest loss surface in the U.S. history? Are there other things happen around the world that people observed, or just interest in conservation and wow, they may be seeing this forest disappearing in places?
A lot of US history is tied to what happened in Europe. And of course, Europeans had gone through a lot of forest loss, especially in Germany and Great Britain with the Industrial Revolution as it started up in the 1700s. And there were two needs. There was an energy need, and forests were a great source at that time for energy, kind of before coal was really, we were able to sort of get coal out of the ground and use it on an industrial scale. So trees were kind of the thing, but also, there was colonial period, and there was a great demand for trees for building boats and things like that. And so, Europeans have kind of decimated their forests over that time period and had figured out how to manage them. And then in the U.S., the same thing was happening as settlers were moving west. They were basically cutting down trees and converting land into farmland. Here in Ohio, of course, we have the Great Black Swamp in northwestern Ohio that was kind of drained between, say, the 1850s and the 1890s, and that's emblematic of what happened all across the Midwestern U.S. And there were two things going on. One is there was the industrialization of the U.S., and so a lot of that wood was used for good purposes, right? So when you would cut down the trees to turn land from forests into farms, that forest product would often get milled and would get used to build houses somewhere in the eastern US. And some of it would get used for energy and things like that. So there was kind of the dual purpose to that. You think about it, that's actually a very different process from what happens in the tropics today when they create agricultural land. Most of those trees that get harvested in the tropics don't make their way into actual market uses. Most of them just get burned up. But that was a concern as people saw that happening. I sort of point to this gentleman from Missouri, Frederick Starr Jr., Reverend Frederick Starr Jr., who sort of wrote this. Back in those days, people didn't go to Congress and testify, so the form of testifying was to write a piece, and he wrote a rather long piece, sort of pointing out the problems in the Midwest that arose from deforestation. And that's kind of the first sign out there that there was big concern growing on deforestation and the loss of forest land. Really kind of started in the 1850s, picked up steam. The other big famous sort of point there is 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt went to the American Forest Congress. I mean, imagine this, you get the president to come to your industry association meeting and you're thinking he's going to, sort of say some nice things about you. And he really lit into those guys. And it's funny reading the accounts of him. You can imagine, I think he was a pretty forceful personality, right? And he probably, I mean, I would imagine that was a pretty, I don't know about a scary sight, but probably a pretty intense sight with him pointing out to these foresters in the room that they're the despoilers of the land, they're destroying the surface of the U.S., and I'm going to take everything away from you. So it was just kind of a fascinating tale, and it started out, then turned into him pushing for this concept that there was a essentially going to be at some point sort of a scarcity of trees over the next century if we don't do something about it. Of course, what he did is he preserved the federal forest lands in the West. I think he preserved something like 100 million acres of land in federal forests in the West using the 1891 Forest Reserves Act. And he created the U.S. Forest Service at the same time. So that was kind of the next big marker. And, those concerns continued. Another interesting story, and this is a place where we might have gotten it right in the U.S., and probably the best right in the U.S., is in the 1920s and 1930s, there was this concern with the loss of trees and not enough trees around. Got to the point where there were two big reports for the Senate, the Capper report and the Copeland report, and they both recommended that the federal government buy up a lot of farmland in the Midwestern U.S. and basically create forest reserves in the East on a big scale because they did not trust private landowners to reforest their land. And the reality is they got it wrong. Had we done that, we'd probably be in a much worse shape today than we actually are. My guess is we probably have more forest today as a result of private landowners than we would have had with those public lands. And they're probably in better shape today, the forest we do have because of private landowners. So I think it's interesting when you look back at the history, you can see, some good decisions, maybe creating the forest reserves in the West, and maybe we avoided some really bad decisions, that is trying to create even bigger reserves in the East.
Brent, I really liked how you talked about private landowners. Here in southeastern Ohio, we really focus on many programs in our extension work, one being a day in the woods, talking about how we can utilize our woodlands. Because if you look at Ohio, roughly around 84% of Ohio's woodlands is owned by those private landowners. What was the approach to private versus public land resources in the United States?
In terms of the private land ownership, it's pretty much been laissez-faire. Let landowners make the best decision that they can. And this is where, in my opinion, there are externalities, so there are some negative consequences for sure. But by and large, if you look at the big history of the U.S., the decisions that private landowners have led us to a situation today where we have a huge amount of sort of private forest land in the eastern U.S. We have agricultural land that is industrial and produces an enormous amount of agricultural products, right? And that's kind of in those places where production is the highest and the soils are the best and they're the best able to be adapted to heavy production. And the rest of the land is kind of left alone. and foresters are doing a great job with that land. I mean, the biggest complaint really is that there's not enough tree harvesting, that we don't have enough diversity of forest cover in southeastern Ohio for a lot of bird species that would otherwise be here if those forests had a bit more harvesting and a bit more sort of diversity on the landscape. So, that's a super interesting question. And then the other interesting part in the US is in the southern US, these southern pine forests, the ability to manage those and the industrialization of the plantations there has created an enormous resource of timber for our country and an enormous resource of carbon. And so we're basically on those industrial and heavy harvested timberlands creating huge amounts of carbon flux and huge amounts of timber at the same time. It's pretty amazing story, and it's all because of private incentives, as far as I can tell.
Brent, I really liked the article that kind of prompted us to have you as a podcast guest. And it was an article that you wrote here just in April of 2026. And one quote really popped out at me, and it said, and I quote you, with almost without credit, farm and forest productivity growth has enabled a new era of protection in the United States, this time on private land. What prompted you to make that statement in your article, and what kind of suggestions might you have around that quote?
A reason why Southeast Ohio, one reason why, it's not the only reason why, but one reason why Southeast Ohio and big chunks of Ohio are still forested today is because our farmland is as productive as it is. I mean, think of the, 8 billion people on the planet Earth, right? We have to feed those people. Not only that, but agriculture produces a lot of energy as well, right? Both now for the renewable diesel sector as well as the ethanol sector. And if we hadn't figured out ways to make that agricultural land as productive as it is today, we would have just simply used more of the land we have for agriculture. And that would have created less opportunity for a lot of the birds that we have, the sort of, the reemergence of neotropical migrating bird species in this part of the country. It's phenomenal to see them come through here, but it's because we have these highly productive areas of agricultural production. So I've just always been one to think that you have to have balance. You have to figure out ways to make production as good as it is. I mean, people aren't going to live without food, right? And it's just that simple. So we're going to do what it takes to feed ourselves. And if we needed more land to go into agriculture, we would take it. But thankfully, we've been able to make agricultural land more and more productive over time, and that's allowed us and enabled us to sort of protect a lot of other stuff. And you see it on agricultural land too, right? You see people who are, as they get maybe to the end of their farming careers and have some land, they may deed that land to their heirs. They also may take some of it, the least productive of it, and turn it into some kind of protected land, right? And that's, we kind of see that happen. And I mean, it's a great benefit for us. So I don't know. To me, I just think of that we're able to enjoy a lot of this sort of great privately protected and publicly protected land because we have such a productive agriculture and forest sector.
So, what type of economic contributions can we estimate for the value of nature?
That's a great question. Yeah. You know, we do know in Ohio, I don't have the stats for the whole US. We've done a lot of research on this in Ohio, but in Ohio, amazingly, Ohioans take about 180 million trips to go hiking, walking, biking, swimming, boating, fishing, etc. every year, right? So think about 180. It might even be, that was 8 years ago. So it's probably more like 200 million now. So it's an enormous number of trips every year. And each one of those is valued at 34 to 35 to $36 a trip, right? So at the same time, they also spend 34 to $40 per trip on average. Now, not every trip do they do that, but a lot of trips include overnight trips when you're camping and things like that. So, we've sort of summed it all up and estimated sort of the contribution of all that sort of recreational stuff on mostly on publicly protected lands to be around an $8 billion per year part of the economy. So it's about 1.5% of the state's economy right now. So it's an important share, and the benefit people get out of it is probably far bigger than the value it brings to the state, right? I mean, you guys were talking about with mushroom collection. I mean, what would life be like if you couldn't do that, right? I mean, yeah, you'd get by, you'd be fine, you'd survive, but it just makes it a little more pleasant, a little better, right? And if we just take a lot of those kinds of trips off of our radar every year, all of us are just going to not feel as good about ourselves, right? So I think that 8 billion is great, 1.5% of the economy, but the real benefit is, the sort of the great feeling we get out of being able to go out and hunt those mushrooms. In my case, go fishing. In your case, is probably fishing too, but just stuff outdoors is just super fun.
Brent, your expertise is coming straight through in this conversation. I really appreciate your teaching, but also your research, your appreciation to history. But we're going to kind of turn that around and look through that crystal ball and see what your crystal ball reveals related to policy that intersects forestry and agriculture that's coming down the road for us.
Sure, great. That's another great question. My crystal ball is probably as muddy and murky as anyone else's. So, and probably I'm an economist, so it shouldn't be trusted at all, probably. But I'll do the best to sort of think of some things. And when I look out there, I look at the ag sector that's hurting right now, and I think one of the issues there with the ag sector is that prices are low and input costs are high. I was actually had dinner with someone who's a farmer the other night, and they asked, where are we going? I mean, do you think how many farmers are going to go out of business and things like that? And that's not a question I can really answer, but it's a deep concern I hold that I think a lot of other people hold as well. So we're kind of in a sort of an uncertain period right now with respect to the agricultural sector. The forestry sector is in a similar position, maybe not as bad, but prices are pretty low for forestry products as well, and those costs are high. So we're kind of in a real period of change, and what I think that probably means is that in the future, we're going to see doubling down and intensification. Probably see that there's going to be a few less acres in agriculture in the U.S. a decade to 15 years from now. I don't know where that's going to be exactly, but probably on the margins, at the edges, probably in those places where forests are, and we're going to see a little more forest land. We do know globally that deforestation is in fact reversing itself as population stabilizes globally, and basically the need for food becomes a little less intense going down the road. We're going to see countries like Brazil. I mean, the next 5 to 10 years, they're probably still going to continue to create new land in soybeans and things like that, and corn as well. But that's going to become a less of a pressure going down the road. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, the agricultural sector is probably going to, in the U.S., have a few less acres in agriculture, a few more acres in forestry, and we're going to continue to see those crop yields increase. And I would suspect that at some point in the next couple of years, prices have to turn around. So hopefully that bodes well for many. Land values are certainly going to stay high, and I don't see any sort of slowdown in land value accumulation and increases. So yeah, in terms of what that means for protected land, I don't. I think that most protection in the U.S. of land is going to happen privately. That it's going to be private landowners making those decisions. I don't see the federal government making any new big sort of protection. In fact, we're kind of rolling back things right now. The Forest Service is talking about rolling back the roadless rule, which would roll back some of the sort of more intensively protected areas. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's much of a crystal ball. That's just sort of opining on a few different things. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Probably not all that revealing though.
Brent, we really appreciate you being on the podcast today. Would you like to wrap up with some final thoughts or anything else you want our viewers to know?
I would just say Ohio has some incredible places, and when you go to some of those wildlife areas in the state of Ohio that are owned by the state of Ohio, many of them were privately protected, right? They're private landowners who donated those spaces to the state, and I mean, get out to those and enjoy them. Look for the mushrooms. Look for the birds are starting to come through, right? So they're sort of migrating from South America up to Canada and coming right through here in the next few weeks. So get out and do that because this is the time of year to really spend some time outside, and especially if you are farming and you got a big heavy month coming up, take a little time to go out and see something in the outdoors you may not have seen so far, and chances are good you'll find it here in Ohio.
Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.